Hello everyone, Mariko Berg, residential realtor with the Bridgewell Real Estate Group, and welcome back to the Bridgewell Group YouTube channel where I talk about all things real estate, particularly in my market, which is the Greater Vancouver and Fraser Valley area. But today's video is also going to be very specific to British Columbia and also relevant to all of you in Canada. So make sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more real estate news, tips, tricks, updates, and more. Today's video is going to be talking about subject removal and the subject removal period. And so I'm really going to break down everything that you need to know about subject removal. I'm going to be going through what is a subject, what are common subjects, how long is the subject removal period, the subject removal process and the timeline, how deposits play into subject removal, and a lot more. So why don't we just get into it? So starting off with the basics, what is a subject? A subject is also known as a condition, and it's something that needs to be satisfied in order for the real estate transaction to move forward. So this is going to typically be for the sole benefit of a buyer, and so more commonly than not, we're going to be talking about buyer subjects, or you're going to see buyer subjects on a contract, but in some unique situations, you may also see seller subjects. So dealing with the most common subjects that we're seeing on contracts being accepted, you're going to see subject to financing, so subject to the buyer obtaining and approving satisfactory financing, subject to a title search, subject to property disclosure statement, subject to inspection, subject to documents, and so this is going to depend on the situation, but for example, a detached home, maybe it's a survey certificate, reviewing that, but more commonly we're going to be dealing with strata documents for strata homes, obviously, like condos and townhouses. Last but not least, it's very common to see subject to insurance, so the buyer being able to obtain satisfactory insurance on the property. But as I said, like subjects can be for buyers and sellers. You can also see longer subjects, like a subject to sale, so a subject to the buyer selling their existing home. But you can essentially make up any subject. It's a condition that needs to be satisfied in order for the buyer, typically, to do their due diligence, but potentially also the seller. So how long is the subject removal process? This is completely dependent on what is negotiated on the contract, but it's very common to see around a 5 to 7 business day turnaround for these standard buyer subjects that we are talking about in this situation. You might also see subject to sales, again, which is a subject to the buyer being able to sell their existing home, in which case, obviously, you will have a much longer subject removal period. That could be 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, depending on what is acceptable by both parties and the average days on market for that particular home that the buyer is trying to sell. So long story short, the length of time for subject removal is completely negotiable, but it's generally going to be around a week. So next, I'm going to be discussing the subject removal process. And so when we are dealing with an offer, typically what we are going to be negotiating are price subjects, the subject removal date, and then also the dates themselves, so completion, possession, and adjustment day. So let's say that you choose the property, you've done your market analysis, you've done the negotiations, and you get an accepted offer. So we have an accepted offer, and now we have these subjects to be able to do our due diligence on the property. So let's say that this subject removal period is about a week long. So let's say that we got an accepted offer on a Monday, and we are going to have the 5 business days plus the weekends. Let's say that subject removal is on the Sunday. Okay, so during that period of time, we're going to be submitting the documents to your mortgage broker. Financing is going to be approved hypothetically. We're reviewing all of these documents. We're satisfied with all of them. The inspection, we're satisfied. Insurance, we're satisfied. Check, 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 check. We're happy. Now we are going to remove subjects, which is just by way of an addendum saying that we're satisfied with the subjects on the contract and we're hereby moving forward with the purchase. Now, when we negotiated at this accepted offer, we would have also negotiated when the deposit is going to be due. So typically it is upon or within 1 day of subject removal. So again, if your subject removal is Sunday, if it's upon subject removal, then your deposit's going to be due on Sunday. But the way that we word our contracts is typically 1 business day of subject removal. So in this case, it would be Monday. And then this is when the deposit is due. And then the property is considered sold, or also known as firm. So this is a very happy situation, but let's take a situation instead where we were not able to satisfy subjects. So let's say that you got your financing done, your title search, property disclosure statement, everything is great, but you get to the inspection and you're like, oh, damn, I'm really not happy with this inspection. The seller's not willing to negotiate. Nobody is able to make this work, and you've decided, okay, I'm going to collapse this deal. So this is exactly what that subject removal period is for. It's for you to be able to do your due diligence to make sure that you're satisfied and want to move forward with the property. So if one of these conditions cannot be met, then that would be a situation where you could collapse the property. So in this situation, we are not moving forward with subject removal, and so we just have to inform the other side that we are collapsing the deal, and oftentimes a collapse form is required. So as you can see here, a question that I get often is, do I lose my deposit if I don't remove subjects? So it's going to come back to how the original accepted offer was worded, but typically these subjects are for you to be able to do your due diligence, and the deposit is usually upon or within 1 day of subject removal. So if you have not removed subjects, if you have not satisfied the condition, that likely means that you have not handed in your deposit, and therefore there is no deposit to lose. So long story short, as long as you're in a standard situation where the deposit is due once subjects are removed, you are not going to lose your deposit if you end up collapsing the deal. But let's take a little bit of a different situation where you are, say, satisfied with your inspection, but instead what you're trying to do is get an extension for the subject removal period. So I would say that this happens most commonly with financing, where, you know, the buyer has done what they can, but maybe the mortgage broker wasn't able to satisfy things by the time subject's removed. Maybe the appraisal didn't come in time. Like, something is ending up taking a little bit longer than expected. So in this situation, you would be asking for an extension. Now, you can ask for an extension for all of the subjects, and the whole subject removal period to be pushed back. But say you've already satisfied title, PDS, inspection, all of these things, and you just need an extension for financing, you could hypothetically remove these subjects and just extend the subject removal for financing. And that might be something that's a little bit more agreeable to the seller. So in order to get this extension, the buyer is going to need to send an addendum that requests that subject removal period be extended, or a particular subject's subject removal period be extended. The seller would have to agree to that. They would sign off on the addendum, and then it would be official, and hopefully they can satisfy that particular subject by this new allotted period of time. So let's say, for example, we're extending the financing subject. We would talk to the mortgage broker, ask them how much more time they need. Maybe they need until Wednesday now, right? And so we would sign that subject removal extension until Wednesday, and now Wednesday would become that new subject removal period. So in this situation, hypothetically, the deposit would now be due on Thursday. So getting into a fun topic, that is subject-free offers. And so this is probably a term that you guys have heard before, and it's essentially meaning that there are no subjects on a contract. So no financing subject, no document subject, no inspection. And so this is a very hot topic because it is something that is less risk for the seller, because it means that there's more confidence that their home is sold because there's no due diligence or no option for a buyer to back out, right? But for a buyer, obviously that's a lot more risk because they don't have that same standard period of time to do the due diligence. And so different provinces, different countries deal with this in different ways, but here in British Columbia, they've actually implemented something newer called the rescission period, or the cooling off period, which applies to all offers, which means any offer, whether you have subjects or you do not have any subjects, now has 3 business days from the accepted offer date to be able to do their due diligence. So that means that no offer is truly subject free in British Columbia anymore, because there's still this time period where you get to do your due diligence, most notably financing or reviewing documents, all of those things. So getting into the differences between this rescission period, mostly notable to subject-free offers or a subject removal period, it's helpful to kind of break it down into this timeline again. So it's going to be 3 full business days from accepted offer. So if we take a situation like we had before where we got the accepted offer on Monday, that means that your rescission period is going to start on that Tuesday. You get the Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday until full end of day to be able to decide whether or not you are moving forward with the purchase. Now, the biggest difference between the rescission period and a subject removal period is that if someone backs out with relation to the rescission period, the buyer owes the seller compensation of 0.25% of the purchase price. So 0.25% of the purchase price as a penalty for invoking your rescission period and collapsing due to something that you've decided is not satisfactory. So the reason why I say that this applies to a lot more of the subject-free offers than the subject offers is because if you have subjects on your contract, so say for example, that Monday to Sunday, we had added in here that we have a financing subject, that we have documents, right? That we have inspection, right? All of these things are still options for you to be able to do your due diligence and back out no harm, no foul, as long as it's with relation to these subjects. So if you have subjects on a contract, why would you ever invoke this rescission period? Because with subjects, you don't have to pay a penalty to the seller if you collapse. But with the rescission or cooling off period, you do, right? So this is obviously a lot more relevant if you do not have subjects on a contract and you're trying to be more competitive, you're in a hot seller's market, you really want to make your offer stand out. That is when potentially you would write that subject-free offer and then roll the dice on doing your due diligence during this period of time and hypothetically potentially have to pay this penalty to the seller in the event that you do back out. But otherwise, you're just going to be using your standard subjects and you don't have to worry about a penalty or a rescission fee. So this is really that big difference between subject-free and with subjects, particularly in British Columbia where we have this rescission period. So last but not least is what happens after the subject removal period. So we kind of already touched on the deposit when I was talking about the subject removal timeline, but just as a quick recap, let's say that we have subjects on a contract and then that deposit is going to be the next step that makes this firm and binding. So it could be upon or within 24 hours of subject removal, 48 hours of subject removal, the next business day, however that contract is originally worded when you get that accepted offer. So the next step after subject removal is going to be removing the subjects by way of an addendum and then handing in that deposit. So again, when you had negotiated the original accepted offer, you would have also negotiated dates. So this is going to be a time period in between whatever that negotiable amount is, where you're going to be waiting for the completion day. And so the completion day is the day that title transfers, it's the day that money transfers from the buyer to the seller. And so this is the day that you are also going to be having everything done and signed with the lawyer to make sure that title is transferred. And then shortly after that, you are also going to have the possession day, which is the day that you get the keys. Thanks for watching this video on everything that you need to know about subject removal, particularly here in British Columbia, Canada. If you are looking for a realtor and real estate team to help you with your purchase or your sale, definitely feel free to reach out to my team at Bridgewell Real Estate Group. We focus primarily in the Greater Vancouver and Fraser Valley areas, and we'd be more than happy to help you through your real estate journey. Thanks so much for watching and have a great day.